helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore the cutting edge of wellness for our mind, body, and spirit. Now, as the parents of teenagers, talking about dating can be a tricky one, but we have to approach this in a good way because it could have a lasting impact on the well-being of our children. And that's why I've invited child psychologist Dr. Saunders to help us learn about how to talk to our kids about dating. Welcome, Dr. Saunders.
Thank you for having me, Kara.
Yeah, I think back in the day, in the movies, you're like, okay, so-and-so, they come to the door, you got to be home by 10, you're going out for a burger. Those days were simpler, but they're gone, right? This is not reality.
Those days are gone.
Yeah, okay. So I'm in this, right? I've got a 14-year-old and a 17-year-old and trying to figure out all of this because even with social media, the way they start talking to each other is different now. So we're gonna do some 101. I wanna break it up a little bit into girls and boys because maybe there are some differences and some overlap, but let's just talk the general question. What's step one? Like, how do we talk to teenage girls about dating?
So I think step one that I like to remind parents is that this is not a conversation as if it's like an inoculation, which happens one time. This is a series of conversations. It's multiple and to some degree ongoing. I do like to acknowledge that these conversations are very uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable for the adult. They're extremely uncomfortable for the teen. But it even starts earlier than that, where you start to impart what your kind of overall values are, right? I mean, I was with a friend recently who's, made a joke that their 11-year-old was dating. And I, of course, inserted 11-year-olds don't date. That's not date. There's no, they can have friends, but there should be no dating at, 11, 12 years old. And obviously that's my value system, right?
Right.
But once we talk about, getting into high school or getting a little bit older, so knowing like there's really no one-on-one dating before a certain age. That might be, kind of a place that you start because what's also hard about this day and age, and I know that we'll get more into this, is the nature of dating has changed considerably from 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah, right. And so they might think, our kids already, when they're teenagers, don't think we know much, but they're really going to think we're old-fashioned, perhaps, when it comes to some of this stuff, perhaps. But let's just start with the age. You said 11, 12-year-olds don't date, although they might have little crushes. But from the mouth of a child psychologist, what age is okay?
So that doesn't mean you can't have feelings, right?
Yeah.
You can have a crush or you can have feelings for someone, but I would strongly urge that there's no, what I would call dating, okay, or probably you and I might have a similar definition, which is one-on-one without adult supervision. I don't think that there should be any one-on-one without adult supervision, certainly below the age of 14 or 15. And I always want to make sure that the two individuals are fairly close in age. I certainly don't want a 15-year-old dating an 18 or 19-year-old.
Mm-hmm. I think the tricky thing is kids start going out in groups. Like if you're a parent and you've seen the movie 8th Grade, which was shown here in West Hartford, Connecticut, and we were a little shocked by what we saw in that movie 8th Grade about how everything can change. And there was some sexual activity going on, maybe not intercourse, but there were, sorry, I've got alarms going off here, but so it was a little shocking to see like, wow, 8th grade, maybe this is definitely not what your grandparents had thought about, or even you. So what are our kids being faced with that might be really different from what we're used to?
Well, what happens with social media and a lot of social media platforms is that there's chatting that goes on in the DMs, as the young people say, the direct messages. So there's chatting and other kinds of things that happens that you might not be aware of. I mean, there's a subgroup of individuals who have pretty significant social anxiety who might be chatting or dating someone that doesn't even live within 1,000-mile radius of their home. And so I worry a little less about that, although I do think there's a bigger risk of catfishing, which is someone pretending to be someone that they're not, right? They say they're a 16-year-old boy from Missouri, but they're actually a 45-year-old man from Alabama or whatever.
Yeah.
But that's kind of a separate issue. But there's a lot more work that has to be done on the part of parents to provide guidelines and some rules for their teens.
So one rule that I was growing up with was always, that you're never allowed to have, I don't think at any age, we were never allowed to have a boy in your room. People were allowed to go to the basement or people were allowed to go to other rooms, but even like just structural things in your house or other people's houses, I feel like that gets tricky because even if they're not alone, they might be hanging out in groups, but I guess teens are teens. They find ways to be alone.
Yes, and to those kinds of guidelines in terms of like, you're in a common area of the house. And if you're in a common area of the house, as the adult who owns the house, I could walk through at any time, right? So you need to be in a common area. You need, I do think it's better when there's other friends present because it changes the dynamic. So it's not a one-on-one situation. I do think if you can be that parent that is willing to invite that, group or, small group or, 2 or 3 kids over to your home, that way you actually get to see what the interactions are like. You have some knowledge of these individuals. So I like to embrace that. I want to be the parent that has them. I want to have them at my house because then I want to see what's going on.
Okay. And then we just say, even if you happen to have a finished basement, seems like always the kids want to go to the houses with the finished basements. You say, I'm going to be coming down sometimes. Even though,
I could come down anytime. I own the house.
Weird. Yeah.
Right. And I might go down and say, do you want a soda? Do you want some popcorn? Right. I'm going to be a host.
Yeah.
But I'm going to pop in at any time.
What do you do if you pop in and you don't like what you see?
Well, then you have to say things directly, and you realize if you haven't had some conversations, it's certainly time for the conversation. And I think that once you come down into the room as an adult, once they realize you're there, hopefully they're going to, separate themselves. But that's when you have to either reinforce guidelines that you've previously set up or say, listen, I'm okay with you guys hanging out. I'm not comfortable with physical intimacy in my house. I think you're both very young, whatever age they are. If they're 17 or 18, that's a slightly different story, but you still might say, I'm not comfortable with this physical intimacy in my house. I'm worried that you're not ready for this. You can express your feelings. They might not agree. Let's face it. Teenagers and young adults have been sneaking around in relationships since the beginning of time.
Right.
So, I'm not saying they won't find a way to get their time together. But it also is your, I think, duty and responsibility as a parent to impart what your values are and what your concerns are.
Yeah, so you mentioned this is not a dictation. It's not a presentation of this is everything I want you to know. This is more of a back and forth and also several conversations. But how do we start with that values statement? In your values might be quite different from the other people that your kids are friends with or even just the time they're living in.
So that's why it's so important to get to know your teens' friends. I always took on the task of I would then become friends with the parents.
Yep.
So if I ever had a question or concern, I had a way to check in on a piece of information, and I absolutely did that on many occasions. I wanted, my child says, "Oh, I'm going to go hang out with so and so, or I'm going to stay over their house." I'm going to call that parent and say, are you having a couple kids over tonight or what's going on? So it is that level of supervision and taking it to the next level. It is much harder when they're, texting and doing other things because they can really get to be pretty sneaky. But imparting your values, as I've said, is not a one and done. It's not an inoculation. You're doing that over time. And it is pretty common that teens and young adults do their best to reject their parents' values. But what we also see is often they circle back around. Now that can take years, so it takes a lot of patience.
Yeah. So I'll ask the big question. Do you talk about sex?
I think you absolutely have to talk about sex. I think it's foolish to believe that if you don't talk about sex, therefore it won't be an issue. It is the reason why sex education absolutely needs to be taught within school systems, because it's really about information, and knowledge is power, right? You need the information and the education in a setting that is not as emotionally loaded as it might be for a parent and a teen. You talk about what your value system is. I think it's really, really important to talk about how physical intimacy changes the nature of a relationship. It changes your feelings, it changes your expectations. And I think a lot of young people don't realize that, how much it changes the relationship.
Okay. So, is there a difference with how we're going to talk to our girls versus our boys? As much as we want to be all with equality about many things, is there a difference when we're talking about dating and sex with teens that are boys or girls?
I guess I'd like to say there shouldn't be a difference, but I think the reality is that there is a difference. But there's still those opportunities to kind of impart your values. What you would say to your teen boy, and again, what you say to someone at 14 or 15 is probably going to be different to what you say that's 17 or 18, because there is a little bit more maturity under their belt. If you're someone who is absolutely against any kind of physical intimacy, and you impart that information, and you don't really have any control over what your child does or doesn't do when they're not in your direct supervision. That's why I do think information and education around, protection and birth control and those kinds of things, both males and females, and any non-binary folks, they need to know the basic information, because the reality is and I didn't want to get into the statistics on this rate of sexually transmitted infections is rampant among teens and young adults, and among the elderly, interestingly. And so they need to understand some good basic information on how to protect themselves.
Yeah, okay. And so this is going to be maybe uncomfortable. Let me ask you this. My pediatrician, when my kids were going through puberty, recommended a book for each one of them. Is there a book that you really like as a psychologist that you would want your kids to read and then talk about it with you later?
There are some good books. I can't recall them off the top of my head, but I do. And so, that is good. And I'm sure we could get some resources, but it doesn't take the place of a real old-fashioned conversation.
Yeah, even if they've seen the movies at school and had the sex education, which, by the way, my daughter goes to a parochial school and they don't do that. So, you really have to have that information come from you, I guess, because in some schools they might not. And I know in the public schools they are, and you sign the document whether or not you want them to see the movies or whatever. But one thing that if we are having a conversation that really goes to boys and girls and probably starts at an early age is ground rules for dating. You say you want to tell your kids you should be yourself. Don't pretend to be someone that you are not, and don't be afraid to eat on a date.
Right. So, there's lots of gender expectations and gender role behaviors that individuals feel like they have to engage in when they're dating, right? Unfortunately, girls buy into the fact that they really shouldn't be eating on a date, or they just eat a few bites. And, because they have to be thin and demure and whatever other, ridiculous stereotypes we have for our young people. But to really talk to your teen about being yourself, right? If you're dating someone and you're pretending to be someone that you're not, that's really going to be a very difficult thing to sustain over time. We all can take the edge off our more extreme behaviors in the beginning, but we can't sustain that for long periods of time. So if you have to pretend that you're someone that you're not, if you're super athletic and but you want to attract someone who doesn't value that, and then you want to quit athletics, right? That's not being yourself. So, no matter who you're dating, and the reality is there's, same-sex relationships happening in teens also. No matter who you're dating, you want to be able to be yourself.
Okay. And don't forget those other friendships. I know there are high school relationships that can seem like they're serious, but if you neglect those other friendships, what happens?
It's really important to remember that in this day and age, very, very few of those high school relationships last into adulthood. Now, I actually have two brothers that are, married the girls they dated in high school, but it's less and less common. And, to really remember that just because you are dating someone, that you don't want to neglect your friendships, because you will need those relationships and those friendships when inevitably something goes wrong in your relationship, or even if you're having difficulties, or even if you just want to stay connected to your friends because you want to say, hey, this happened on this date, or this happened when I was hanging out with my boyfriend, girlfriend. Does that seem funny to you? Right? You want someone to give you that feedback. So not to neglect your friendships, because if you continually neglect your friendships, when you come back and need them, they're not going to be there.
And you want to explain what consent means. This can be tricky in today's day and age. I'm hearing all kinds of things that are just a little bit different, especially boys really worried about this. So what do we need to talk to our kids, or what do we need to say to our kids about consent?
All right. And this is also a conversation where you really need to keep, emotional development in mind as well. What you're saying to someone who's 15 or 16, again, is different than what you're saying to someone who's 17 or 18. But that the importance of understanding what consent means. I give you permission to, or we are talking about something explicitly. And again, these conversations are very uncomfortable, right? They're uncomfortable for the teens to say, I'm not comfortable doing that, and to be able to assert that boundary for yourself. Or I am comfortable doing that, but I'm not ready yet, right? So no matter what that is. So to be clear on what you agree to or what you don't agree to. And part of this process is understanding what makes you feel comfortable or uncomfortable. And if you feel uncomfortable, and regardless of gender, if you feel uncomfortable when it could be a conversation, it could be something physical. If you feel uncomfortable, that is a red flag that you need to put up a boundary, and you need to say, I feel uncomfortable. I'm not ready to do this. Or, I feel like we're sneaking around. This makes me uncomfortable. So to really start to hone in on that inner intuition, I feel uncomfortable, or this feels okay for me. Okay.
So that may be a conversation, that language, I'm thinking, could be a little uncomfortable for parents who might just want to say, I don't want you having physical intimacy, at least I don't want you having sex or that kind of level of physical intimacy at all in high school. Is that unrealistic?
Well, I think parents have the right to impart their values. That whether or not realistically their teen will adhere to that is a different story. I mean, I don't have the stats on, first, ages of first physical intimacy, but it's right around 16 or 17. But if that's the average, that means sometimes it's 14, sometimes it's 18, 20, or in their 20s. So you can certainly impart your values, but what I don't want parents to do is put their head in the sand and say, I told my child I don't want them to have any physical intimacy, and so I believe they never will, or they won't until they're married. So not to put your head in the sand, especially when you're seeing signs that your teen is in a more serious or committed relationship, right? So it's out of that initial chatting phase. And a lot of these relationships go through phases where they don't tell anyone about it. It's just the two individuals engaging in a lot of extra conversations. You see your teen talking late at night on the phone with someone. You ask who that is. Oh, it's just a friend, right? You see those things and you realize, okay, well, that's just the initial phases. Okay, now this has been going on a while. I need to have some more conversations.
Well, and just even the phone, right? It used to be that you'd have to call. Someone would say, this is the Saunders residence. May I speak to Laura? And no one's doing that anymore. We don't always know. And so there's a lot of talk right now that we are really protecting our kids physically, but not much virtually. And yet so much of their life is on virtual. So even like I've seen in our stories in the news where kids getting in big trouble for sexting, for sending naked pictures, which apparently is a very common thing now, but it's also against child pornography laws. So can we talk about, I guess we need to have that conversation.
Absolutely, because, right. So that, that might feel like it's okay, right, to take a picture of a body part and send it to someone who might be asking for it or trying to entice them. But what they don't realize is that that picture then can get sent to anyone, even though the other person says, no, 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 I would never share it. Inevitably, when they break up, it gets shared. And that it does, I mean, I'm not a legal expert by any means, but it does oftentimes infringe on rules of pornography and sending pornography through all sorts of media. So
Yes.
you have to be very, very careful with that.
Yes, we've had some media folks on where just say, you know, you can't distribute child pornography. So if you have two young people sending pictures of each other, it actually rises. There's a whole bunch of issues I know just with your development that you want to talk about, but that also could get the kid in a little bit more trouble, and schools get involved. So I guess we need to have those are conversations that we never had to talk about. And that's one of the things you want to ask yourself is, did anyone ever talk to you about dating, about sex, and what was your reaction? You want parents to have that question to themselves.
Yes, and you know, this is where that kind of, you know, those values clarification, right? You talk with your spouse or your partner, or if you're a single parent, maybe you talk to a sibling or a friend, you know, to just have someone to bounce some things off of in terms of like, am I being realistic or unrealistic? Parents always have the right and responsibility to impart their values. What they don't have control over is what their child, which of the values their child adheres to and which are the ones they reject. But it doesn't mean you don't keep letting them know what your values are. It's okay to do that, but I think parents often need some support around that as well.
We sort of have a idea that we try to protect our girls more, and maybe boys will be boys. The idea that boys are going to lose their virginity at a younger age. I don't know if that's true, but there's that thought that like, oh, boys, but I really got to protect the girl. That's how it's been, at least in the past. I don't know if people are changing with that, but is it as parents, should we have different standards for boys and girls, or how do we address that boy-girl dynamic?
I guess what I'd like to say is I don't want to have different standards for boys and girls. I don't want to, you know, I want the standards to be based on what my values are, and whether those are religious-based values or just kind of moral values or values that were passed down to you. So I'd like to provide communication and clarification around what my values are. And, you know, I do think that, you know, the longer you can put off physical intimacy, the better it is for your emotional development, because it does change the nature of relationships. And it's really, really hard. So I'll tell you, you know, when I worked on an child and adolescent inpatient psych unit, I would say probably the number one reason for a significant, you know, drop in a depressive episode, or God forbid, an intent to harm oneself, you know, often the reason for that was the breakup of that first relationship, because that it seems devastating at the time, because you're 16, 17 years old and you feel like I'll never find anyone like the person that just dumped me. So it is a devastating event when it happens, and I don't like to minimize that. But what teens lack that adults have is perspective, right? When you're 25 or 27 or 30 and you've had several relationships, you realize, okay, well, this is what I liked in this person, or this is what values are important to me. And you have that perspective. But when you're 16 or 17 years old and you're going through that first big breakup, it is devastating. And I'm not saying you don't engage in relationships because you want to avoid the emotional fallout of a breakup, but you just try to keep things as tempered as possible, and hope that it'll work out for the best.
Yeah. In your experience, as you're dealing with kids, are they interested in having one-on-one relationships as much, or has it changed?
I think it's changed, but I still think that teens are looking for those one-on-one connections. They want someone that's going to make them feel special. They want someone that, you know, that feeling that you get. We all can go back on this, right? We can all remember when that, you know, one of those early times in our lives, you know, as teens or young adults, where we felt like, wow, someone has the same kind of feelings for me as I do for them, right? a lot of times when you're younger, you'll have a crush on someone and they don't even know that you exist. But that first match of like, wow, this person is into me and I'm really into them, is an amazing feeling, right? And so that kind of those kind of feelings become very, very powerful, right? Endorphin rushes and all sorts of things, serotonin rushing through your brain, right? It really is very, very powerful. It is like a drug.
Okay. And another thing that you say we should say to both teens and both boys and girls, we should tell them, don't play games. You want to say what you mean and mean what you say. Set clear expectations in a relationship.
Yes. So, and this is developmental also. I mean, a lot of teens don't yet have the skill to like identify how they feel and then express it directly, right? That comes with maturity. But what you really don't want is your teens playing emotional games like, if you don't do this for me, I'm going to break up with you, or if you break up with me, I'm going to kill myself, right? To really be very, very careful about the words that you use and how that might be like you're playing an emotional game with someone, because it really, really wreaks havoc on the feelings of those people around you.
And for the adults around them, I guess, how much, and we probably only have about a minute and a half left, but how important is it how we model, whether we're in a traditional marriage or maybe you're dating as an adult, how important is the adult model?
I think the adult model is really important. And it is, as uncomfortable as it is trying to, when you notice your teen, they look like they were hanging out with someone and now that doesn't seem to be happening anymore. And they're kind of like withdrawn and isolated and feeling bad, saying to them, what's going on? There seems like there's been a change and your teen may or may not admit to it. But to be that person, that parent that is at least willing to start that conversation. They might not talk to you then, but they might talk at a later time. So the modeling is also about my openness to communication.
Yeah, yeah. So the bottom line, if there's a theme in this, we really want our kids, we want this to be less dogmatic and more to let them know that this is an open door, because if a mistake is made or there's a problem, we really want our kids to come to us because they're going to get it from somewhere else if they don't.
They are going to get the information from somewhere else. And while you can be dogmatic and this is the way it has to be and this is the way you will do it, teens since the beginning of time have been circumventing that. So I like to be realistic.
Yeah. Dr. Laura Saunders, some really important thoughts that we can echo, like that physical intimacy, it does change the relationship and changes sometimes how you're feeling. And that's a very tender spot for teens. So thank you so much. Thanks for helping us navigate this difficult conversation as usual.
Thank you, Kara.
And for all of you, you can follow me at Kara Sundlin for more information on the cutting edge of wellness. Have a great day and be well.